they're with us. And without further ado, I would actually like to introduce you to our first keynote speaker, Joseph Avakian. And I was trying to figure out a way to introduce him that sounds really professional, but it's quite difficult because he is a very good friend. And so I'd like to just take a little bit of the time. He's been with YWAM for over 37 years. He is, for me, one of these key people that carries more than just one or two things. He is someone who carries a tremendous amount of wisdom in various areas. He is Lebanese, born in Lebanon, raised in Cyprus, and he is a various he's had various roles. I mean, director, lecturer, communicator, writer, designer, artist, cook, musician. I mean, you name it, he is. And but what I love about him is his ability to communicate with multiple generations, his ability to connect in ways that just opens up who Jesus is. And that is what is so special about him. He's really a peacemaker. And I admire that. And if I had to be stranded with anybody, Joseph would be it. Just to have conversation and spend time with him is just been an absolute highlight for me over the years. And so I'd just like to just hand it over to Joseph. And yeah, thank you for being with us.
Well, thank you, everyone. And well, it's afternoon for us, so I can't say good morning anymore. I can say good noon because it's after 12 here in Berlin, where I am. Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to share. Thank you, everyone. Of course, Rebecca, being my friend, she said, hey, would you be interested in sharing some of the wisdom or some of the things that you have learned over time? And in our conversation over the last few weeks, we realized that maybe this topic of the image of God is something that I would probably be good to start with. The reason why I teach on the image of God is because by trade, I am a graphic designer. I work with branding. And as a believer, I very early started thinking about this concept of how do we brand God? Not that God needs any branding. We know that he does a very good job of communicating who he is to all mankind. He's done that through generations and through centuries. And so I don't think I'm trying to bring anything new here, but rather what I would like to do this morning as we begin is kind of reflect a little bit on where have we come from, specifically the last 2,000 years. How has Christianity been expressed, communicated, preached, shared, and then to the point that now looking back and probably looking with the present state of affairs, of life, of culture, of generations, how do we look at God and so on. So I'd love to take us the next 40 minutes on this journey of God's image. And I think for me, it started out of my background. So just to give you a bit of background why I teach on this. So I was born into an Armenian family in Lebanon, where my father was Orthodox, my mom was Catholic. So I was very at home with the Orthodox, with the Armenian Orthodox Church, as well as the Catholic churches, specifically the Maronite, be it being in Lebanon, because there's that Eastern Rite church of Catholics called the Maronites. And then, of course, moving to Cyprus, I was put into a Brethren church or a Brethren school that had, of course, a church as well. So I was suddenly presented or introduced to evangelicalism, or at least the evangelical side of things, and more probably what we would call the classic evangelicals. So then I was in a Brethren church for a couple of years. I was even active, and later I got to know Youth of the Mission, and I got to know the more charismatic side of the evangelical movement. Then that led me to eventually move to Germany, where I met my wife, who's actually a Lutheran. So she comes from the Lutheran church, and got married also in a Lutheran church. So I've been baptized as an Orthodox, did my first communion as a Catholic, ended up getting married in the Lutheran church, and I work with a charismatic organization. So you can imagine I have had the plethora of experience of honoring God, worshiping God, and being told what is allowed and what is not allowed, or what should and should not be done when we engage with God. Fascinating journey. And that, I think, led me in my 30s and 40s to really reflect and go, how come that our image of God is very much often defined by the community of people we hang out with? So that led me to the conclusion that most of us, probably our image of God is based on what we have been inherited, taught, communicated to about God, plus our own journey and experience of discovery of who God is. And how that often, even our experience, how we experience God, would be based on what we have been told about God, of who he is and how he is. And when you try to break away from that, it gets challenging often for those of us who then eventually move on into other denominations or finding new communities by which they discover God or honor God. Small example, in a Brethren church where I was when I started listening to rock, Christian rock music, I was told electric guitars are evil because, you know, somehow the electric sound can actually have demonic powers. So, you know, when you take extremes like that and you suddenly realize the world is quite diverse when it comes to who God is. And at the end of it, I realized, you know, us as individuals, we can only grasp God in a, how should I say, in a small manner. And then out of that experience that we have with God or discovery of God that we engage with, then we end up communicating who God is. And I think that that kind of challenged me to come to this question, which I want to start with and probably discuss, is if God is so wonderful, so amazing, and the God who he says he is, how come that the majority of the world does not want to do anything with him? And so I have some slides ready, so we can look at them as well, so you don't have to look at my face all the time. I am a visual person. So I'm gonna share my screen and then we'll go from there. Let me just share the screen and then do this. There we go. And then we will go full screen. And there we go. So this image of God was very interesting for me because as a visual designer, as a visual communicator, I realized because most of the data today we have, the way we take information is very visual. So the image of God, this image that we create in our head is very often, or that forms that in our hearts as well, is most likely influenced by the things we see. Of course, also by the things we hear. And if we look at the history of Christianity at large, we realize that God often, for example, here in the picture of Michelangelo's, you know, God creating Adam, we recognize that we often also create God in our own image. So not only are we created in the image of God, we also can very easily, thinking that we are created in the image of God, we try to shape God, form God, texture God, and so on, compose God in the ways that we think is most fitting to probably what we believe. And this is normal. All humans do this. And there's nothing wrong, whether it's Christianity or other religions. It depends. Often they'll end up trying to create some kind of imagery because we are beings who are needing of communication. We need information input. And as much as we take information in, we have to also communicate it out. So yet, you know, coming back to this question, if God is who he says he is, then why is it that most people do not want anything to do with him? And I kind of wondered, is God doing a bad job in communicating who he is? Or are we not taking our responsibility more seriously and recognizing that we have a very important key here, that God has chosen you and me to be his image bearers, and those who know him should truly learn to excellently and beautifully articulate and communicate God. And this is what brings me to this topic of the image of God, because I think by the things that I say, by the things that I do, by how I communicate and what I communicate, I would want to reflect the God who I say is now present and residing in me as his image bearer, but as well as those who are sent by him to go and spread the gospel, whether be it in in a vocation of being in the church, or whether be it in everyday life. I don't think that we should say that only those who are called into the church sphere or that arena are primarily responsible for that. I think if I say I believe in Christ, then as a Christian, I should be a good image bearer, a reflector, a radiator of that which, not radiator like a heater, right? So radiator like radiates God's image in the best manner and fashion. Now, the reality is that God has created us, and he's given us a calling to try to communicate him. He's chosen prophets in the Old Testament, and he sent his son, which is, I think, where I want to start with, because Jesus coming into a certain people group, being educated for whatever 3 decades about of his life in who he is, and also being a contributing member of his society, of his community, being a carpenter for many, many years, and people knowing him as someone who fixed their furniture or built things, then going on to ministry and beginning to speak words and ways in ways that people were familiar with, but yet not so familiar with, because he brought new things and yet made sure the context by which in which he communicated was relevant to the time and to the people, but also was very very enticing for a lot of people. They really were attracted to his teachings. They loved what he had to say. Some followed him, but some also hated him. And of course, when I've asked this question about why is it that God is not so much like, most people will end up telling me the simple context of, well, sin separates us from God, and as sinful beings, we would probably run away from what is good to what is bad. And yes, that is true, and I would imagine there's part truth to that. But in general, I don't want to subscribe to that context that everybody is just running away from God. I think a lot of people are looking for truth. And if God is truth, then why is it that more people are not attracted to him? So the images of God that we have are often very solemn, very serious. And especially when I talk to young people, I often realize that when we talk about God, when we talk about Christianity, it seems it's the Christianity of older people, something traditional, something that's been around for a long time. It's been tested. It had its high point. Now it's at a low point, and it's almost like a brand. If you think of Christianity as a brand, and as a brand strategist, I kind of often fall into this weakness of mine that I kind of think strategically on how do you rebrand a company, or how do you rebrand a product? In this case, what would be important, and would it be important to rebrand God? In the sense of not that we change the story or we change the product, but how we present the product. Because we know that God is not a brand, of course. God is beyond all or any product, service, or brand. He is a person who is the creator of all things and wants to engage with us. And so the solemnness has often brought us to this context that Christ is only important whenever there's trouble or whenever there's solemn moments. And I think generally people say, well, I disagree with you. People also, celebrate God when they're happy. Well, we know for a fact that when people are happy, they don't worry about God as much. But whenever they're sad and there's trouble, then suddenly faith, the cry out after the Lord and after God becomes more important. And I guess we have kind of put ourselves into that service area of whenever there's trouble or need, God is there. And it's true. And I think we should do that. There's no doubt about that. But why not also make God a part of their everyday life, the God of celebration, but the God of births, the God of deaths, in the sense of whenever there's funerals and so on. Why isn't he part of everything? And I think it comes down to this idea that we have kind of done this thing of where we've put God above, and there are the spiritual things that are above all things, and then we have the things that are for earth. And we kind of pushed God further away. As a visual communicator and artist, I've trained and educated young people by taking them to museums and showing them how Christ, being the center of a lot of art, slowly disappeared over time. Eventually, even churches started removing the centricity of Christ, other than maybe up on the altar or up front in the church. But on the side, a lot of the imagery and the storytelling often shifted, especially when we think of Catholic traditions, shifted to kings and lords and knights and so on. And I'll show you some examples later. But also in the whether it be in the Orthodox, whether be it in the Catholic, whether it be in the Protestant, what we typically do is we're captivated, or we capture an aspect of who God is. And what we do through that is we get excited on this idea that, oh, this is something I have discovered. And naturally, as human beings, we highlight that. Now, there's no problem in highlighting things. The problem is when you highlight something long enough, by default, we lowlight everything else. So let's say I highlight the characteristic of one of my friends, and I say, oh, or, you know, or for example, my wife, Monica. If I would say to people, oh, you guys need to meet my wife, Monica, she's amazing. And she is the best, you know, kindest person. And she does this, this, and this. If I repeat that all the time, their context of who my wife is will be that of which I have communicated. Now, God is much more than one color. God is the spectrum of all colors in my mind. And so if we highlight the redness of God, then we need to also as much highlight, of course, the blueness of God, or the yellowness of God, and the greenness of God, using colors as the spectrum of who God is. So his different characteristics and nature, we have to keep on highlighting so that people get a broader understanding of who God is and his role in life today. Typically, when we think of God, and my experience with young people often has been, God is, you know, not interested in me, because God is only interested in those who are maybe suffering, or for example, I've had this conversation with young people saying, well, when I struggle, I'll call up to God, but when I'm not struggling, I don't know what we would do. Like, there's no context of what we do with God when life is good. And it's fascinating for me that a young person would be honest enough to say that. Say, well, what would God want to do with me if I'm having a party? Like, would he party with me? Or is God not the God of parties? Or is God not the God of humor? Or is the God not the God of work? Because solving problems is not God's thing. God's more interested in my soul, but not the issues of our day. And so in that context, I've realized very quickly that we have a fragmented image of God, all of us, each one of us, including myself. And I don't think I want to come here today and say I've grasped who God is. I think I have glimpsed elements of who God is. And because of my love for him, I want to invite us and challenge us and remind us that there's much more still to discover. And in his infinite wisdom and his infinite being, there's much more that we need. And I think the way God architected this whole thing for us to discover him is actually very simple, by the sheer fact that he's created many of us, that each of us carrying a facet of who God is. Together, we can then create a better, grander, and a more complete image of God. No one culture, no one individual, no one denomination can actually fully be able to articulate and express the fullness of who God is. I think God shares of himself across the world to those who are hungry for him and gives them revelation of who he is. That, combined with each other, I think will create a better mosaic and a better, grander picture of who God is. Now, when we think of God, we think of him as the holy God. We think of him as not the God of the universe, but, you know, we do sing songs maybe of, you know, God of the universe, God of the stars and the sun and the moon. And yet I think we have kind of, science and religion have kind of, you know, gone separate ways, as we know. And generally still today, science and faith somehow struggle. And my challenge and my fun has been that whenever I do talk to the scientific community and to people who I travel with sometimes, because they happen to sit next to me on a plane when I travel, and they're scientists, I ask them whether they've ever been out in the universe, whether they've been to space, because what they believe is what they have been told by the scientific community and what our telescopes and a few of our satellites have picked up so far. And what is in the distant parts of the universe is pretty much exercising faith as well. We have a glimpse of something, but we figure out by the tools that we have created and discovered that this must be the way things are. Like, for example, I'm sure you've read articles or seen articles online and in probably very prestigious publications, how the universe is going to end. So we've predicted how the universe is going to end, and that requires a lot of faith. So the scientific community is as much a faith community. They just don't want to admit it. But nevertheless, I have had some really good conversations about who God is and how it takes faith to believe in something when you have seen a glimpse of something, but you know there's more. And I guess every scientist is very much like a lover of Christ to a certain degree. They discover its small truth and they want to understand more of it, and they pursue it. And then to be able to converse with a scientist on how much God is also the God of science, the God of maths, the God of chemistry, the God of physics, that when God created the heavens and the earth, he must have used rules of physics and chemistry that we have discovered now, that we love, and that God is the God of physics and chemistry and gardening of animals and so on. And I make the joke of how we don't pray, oh God of all animals, help me solve the problem of how this dog is suffering or whatever. That we are very, or the God of, gardening. Not that I'm saying he should be the God of the garden, but he is the God who started the first garden as far as we know, right? He planted everything, so he knows all things. So why not go to the Lord about this? So our image of God is very defined by where we believe we will discover more. Now, I, as a visual artist, and I think Rebecca mentioned this a little bit, that my background is very diverse. I have done music, I have done art. I've also been always very fascinated with science. I love reading scientific journals. I love understanding how things work. I love technology. I have never feared that I would not discover God in anything or in any place, because God is everywhere. God can be discovered wherever you are truly open and seeking him. So I find myself often trying to rebrand God, or at least I would say my rebranding of God begins with creating more hunger for God. And I tend to travel the world, whether be it in my business transactions, whether be it in my missional transactions and my services within YWAM, I try to deepen the hunger for God, and that God can be discovered everywhere and anywhere. For example, one of my simple intercultural truths is that God has been in the country that you're feeling called to for centuries. The fact that you're going there is because God loves those people and he knows them, he knows their language. And if you go there, you will very quickly be able to open your eyes and allow God to show you how he sees them, how they communicate, what are their cultural values, and be able to then, based on those values, be able to present God to them in a more meaningful, more relevant, and a more powerful way. And I do believe it comes down to communication. Now, of course, when we look at the universe and what God has actually created, even visually, I've always been fascinated by galaxies and the formation of galaxies. And I remember as a designer, I looked at the composition of a galaxy, and then I realized that if we look at our own fingerprint, it has similar patterns. And that God has, he's got a certain signature in many places. And I find it fascinating that God has, if we look at our fingerprint, it looks like the swirl is just like a galaxy. A galaxy is made of billions of stars. And our fingerprint is maybe the traces that were made of thousands of people, because every individual of us is created by two parents who had two parents, and so on. So we are a culmination of those who have gone before us. And we are also made of atoms and proteins and different elements. And no wonder the scientific community loves this idea that we're made of star dust, or that they kind of come to this context of whatever is in the universe, we're made of the same material. Well, if God created all of it, then of course he's going to use similar materials, because they're life-carrying materials, because he's the God who is the God of life. And so this has really brought me to this idea that often what we have done over the last 2,000 years, every denomination, and I'll get into this a little bit more in a few minutes, has highlighted elements of God, and by default lowlighted the other ones. And so let's look at those and kind of see what what has been inherited to us 2,000 years after Christ. Instead of really being imitators of Christ, we often become what I would say clones of our belief communities. And I'm not saying that in a negative way. It's just typically that's what we output. We output similar minded, similar thinking, similar languaged people that end up doing what we have done. And we nurture a culture, we cultivate a culture, and we output people that will go and repeat what we believe is of value. And beautifully enough, God uses that in such amazing ways. It's our own limitations, and I think there's more there to learn and grow. So when we look at God wanting to reveal to us more of who He is, then I want to start with this idea that we often reflect a lot on the men and women of God of the Bible, and we look at the apostles, we look at a lot of the men that God led. For example, in this case, Abraham, and we say, "Oh, I want to have faith like Abraham." I wonder if Abraham prayed and said, "I want to have faith like Noah," and did Noah pray and say, "I want to have faith like Enoch," or "I want to have faith like Adam," and so on? Where did they look back to? Or did they try to engage with God in their given generation, find ways by which to articulate that God, understand that God, and then communicate Him? And I find very often that in our culture, and especially in the circles that I've kind of mostly hang out, that people do go back to the Old Testament and to the New Testament, and they say, "Oh, I want to be like Peter, I want to be like John, I want to be like Paul," and we kind of look backwards as we're trying to define how to move forward. And there's a place and time for that, but that can't be everything. There must be more. There must be ways by which we can communicate God relevantly, effectively, and almost bring Him back to fashion. It sounds really funny when you say, I want to refashion God. It's not that we want to dress Him differently. It's just we need to speak a language that young people today or the next generations would want to fall in love with this God and be able to be hungry for more of who God is, and then have their own encounter with God, which then in turn they will then take and share with others. And we know there's a lot of dynamics here that can take place. There's a lot of variables that can happen where people can discover God in one way and then totally, and we've seen this in the past as well, they can go on a tangent and totally go off track. But we need to trust God that if they truly seek the truth and engage with Him, they will do a great job. Now, when we look at the Orthodox Church, one of the things that growing up in the Orthodox Church, and this might come across as humorous, but it's true. My parents, because they were a mix of Orthodox and Catholics, at Christmas, we often went to the Catholics, but at Easter, we went to the Orthodox. And I think it's because the Orthodox chants, the services that we have, what we highlight of who God is much better articulated over Easter. So I tell the story of how when I was 8 years old, I was at an Easter Mass at the Orthodox Church, and my mom and I were standing because at the service, at least the service that we went to the Armenian Apostolic Church, you had to stand for 4 hours. Now we're talking about standing 4 hours in a service where you're chanting. There's the passion of Christ is being reflected upon and meditated upon. And I remember needing to go to the bathroom. And I remember telling my mom, "Mom, I need to go to the bathroom." And my mom gives me a little tap on the head and she says, "Christ suffered for us. You can hold it now for 4 hours before, so hold it until the service is over." And it's this idea that in the presence of God, we have to behave a certain way. Why? Because we are now reflecting on His suffering. So if Christ suffered, then we need to suffer. And it's true. I guarantee you we're going to suffer. There's no doubt about that. But we need to understand the context of suffering. And we have to understand that, for a child who's 8 years old, his image of God now is being told, well, you can't go to the bathroom when you're in the presence of God because God created you to need to go to the bathroom, but not when you're in service. And it's that it sounds kind of a bit funny, but that was the case. And of course, at Christmas, we went to the Catholics because the Catholics had just a much more celebratory tradition about Christmas. The choir, the candles, the manger, the Christmas tree, the lights. And so my parents literally did what I would call a buffet Christianity. They went to the Catholics whenever it fitted them well. And they went to the Orthodox whenever it fit them well. And you can imagine how, as a child then, having done First Communion and being baptized as an Orthodox, I was often torn, like, why are we going to the Catholic Mass on Sunday mornings and not to the Orthodox Church? Well, because my parents felt it was shorter and easier to go. And in their mindset, and this is just cultural, the Orthodox Church in the Middle East, because it's a minority church, it's not a majority religion, it's a minority religion, often we're very interested in money. So, for example, growing up in Cyprus, where I grew up for almost 8 years of my life, I remember even the locals, the Greeks, would say, oh, I don't like it when the priest comes over to bless my shop because I give him 10 pounds and he wants, 50 pounds. And they're always interested in money. So there's this idea that when it's traditional church, people's image of God has been very much shaped by the behavior of that church, of that denomination. And so in many ways, I wonder why we have a fragmented image of God. Well, very simple. We have a fragmented approach to how we communicate God. Now, we know that Christ is, risen. We know we just celebrated Easter. We're reflecting on the suffering of Christ, the great sacrifice he brought for us to have life. And yet, because he was risen and he went to be with the Father, it feels like he's left us. And I think no one intentionally did this, but there's been a little bit of this idea that God has left us alone. And you see this in culture, in popular culture, where often people will say God is dead or God has left us alone. And even if he existed, he's not really interested in you and me. And this relationship of the creation with his creator is kind of broken. And it's because I think the church highlighted so much of one thing that we kind of, messed up on the other side of things. Now, I did a search one time on the image of God in the internet, and this was one of the images that showed up, as if God is the God who will destroy the earth, and he will come to destroy. And it's kind of sad, because do just a simple image of God in Google, and it's fascinating to see how popular God is, because every person thinks they have discovered the image of God. And there's everything, not just the Christian God. There is, of course, all kinds of other gods that are represented there. It's quite fascinating. But what fascinated me is when I found these images where, of course, Jesus also has been reflected as a person, as a human being. And I think we have removed, in the Orthodox Church, there's this big topic whether the incarnate Christ is fully man and fully God. And there was a lot of theology about that, and it split the Orthodox Church for many years. Eventually, they got together again just a couple of years ago. But it's fascinating how we forget that Jesus was a man, that he lived his life. He had a family, he had friends, he had siblings. He did life before he became, Jesus Christ, the Messiah, who walked the earth and did miracles. And we forget that part of his life. Isn't that where the foundation was to everything that he did? Isn't that where he had to learn and discover who the Father is so that he can communicate and articulate who the Father is? And, I make the joke that, in the Middle East, having grown up there, did Jesus eat garlic? Yes. Did he smell after he had garlic? And people go, no, Jesus wouldn't smell because, he was Jesus. And I'm like, well, why would Jesus not smell and we would smell? If Jesus ate, lots of garlic, lots of hummus. I grew up with hummus, so I'm sure Jesus had hummus. He had beans. Did he have any problems with air in his stomach? Did he burp when he drank something that was too fast? Did his disciples, when they made jokes, did Jesus laugh? Or did he always say to Peter whenever he made a joke that wasn't too appropriate, he said, oh, Peter, one day in heaven, you'll know what true humor is, as if he wasn't engaged with the society and the community he was in. Jesus walked the earth. Jesus slept. When he slept, when they were traveling and the ground wasn't very comfortable, did he wake up and tell his disciples, oh, I slept like on wings of angels? And then all the disciples were complaining because they slept on, a rocky ground. And these things, I think we forget. We have kind of distanced God into either the Sunday God or the God of certain times of my life. But the general part of my life, God is not too present. That's because my image of God, like I said, is fragmented. I found this image as well, called the Lamb of God, which is kind of funny because, knowing animals and having grown up in the Middle East, this is not a lamb, but this is a ram. This is a male lamb. The real picture of a lamb would be more like this. And there was a painting done by an artist where they did a lamb, and the lamb is a young sheep, not a ram. But again, it shows that also our context of who God is very interesting. You see, if we look at history and, in the history of Christianity, we started with a lot of images of God, and the image of God was very iconic when we think of the Orthodox Church. And then later we got into the very much more flamboyant Jesus, the more gold and everything that the Europeans did when the Catholic Church emerged. And then, of course, because of the Reformation, the image of God went even further into another dimension, what I call the typographic God, because suddenly Protestantism came to this idea that it's all about the Word of God and about what God has spoken. This is an infographic of the words that are repeated in a Sunday morning service in an evangelical church. The size of the word correlates with the amount of how often the word has been used in a service on a Sunday morning. And you can imagine the word Lord is used very often. The Lord God said, the people of the Lord, the people of God, God said, the Lord says, Israel, land, house, the house of the Lord. God is against. It's funny that the word against is bigger than for, and so on. And so, of course, growing up also in evangelical community, I remember most of the churches were very barren when it came to images because all the images were removed. And this has a good reason. And I'm not going to get into the academics of it, but if you do some history, church history, you'll realize very quickly that each denomination in a way revolted, or not revolted, maybe let's put it this way. They moved away from what was and created something different and new. And often to highlight that they were different, they nurtured or cultivated different expressions. So the Catholics, for example, built huge cathedrals where the Orthodox churches were typically more smaller chapels with a few large ones. But typically there were smaller chapels and they were more spread out. And then, of course, when the evangelicals came, they stopped building huge cathedrals like the Catholics did and started building little churches that were very barren with images because they were trying to be different than what the Catholics were. And so if we come down to it, literally, I believe that most of our view of God is cultural. And we could discuss this for hours. It's, of course, spiritual in the sense of what spiritual understanding I have been given. It's experiential, what I have experienced. To a certain degree, it's also generational because no one child takes over the same concept of God as the parent. Most of them, if they do believe in God, there'll be something new added to it. Some of us, we try to logic God, we try to make sense of the faiths. Others of us, of course, approach it scientifically. I have met many archaeologists, scientists, and even creationists who really clearly want to prove God scientifically. Of course, God is also very political. We know that he's always on the conservative side of things. God is intellectual. God is for some traditional. And to a certain degree, there's always that mystical element as well. And none of us picks one of these. I think we create a mosaic of all of these things that we decide how mystical, how intellectual, how traditional, how maybe radical our context of God is and how we communicate and articulate him. And this becomes quite challenging, I think, for most of us. Now, if we recognize that each individual in this world has a unique signature in their retina, then I think I would pretty much come to the conclusion also that each one of us, no one person sees God exactly like the other. I think we all form and shape the image of God in our own hearts and minds. And for some, it's more visual. For some, it's more abstract. For some, it's more objective. For others, it's more subjective. But nevertheless, we do this. Now, when we look at the history of the 2000 years, you know that the church started Eastern. So if Islam hadn't come at some point in the 600s, would Christianity today be more Eastern in its very expression? Would we have more minor songs? Would we have had more, Eastern mysticism included in the thing. Now, when growing up in Lebanon and having been influenced by the Maronite church, there's a lot of mysticism there that still is a part of it. And yet it's a minority church. And because of what Islam did, the church, the early church, got destroyed in that region. And of course, then it was a church of the Middle East. It was a god of the Middle East. He was the god of many cultures. And then when it went to Europe, it became the white god. And today, I think we have to come to the conclusion that typically when we think of Christianity, it is seen as the god of the white people. And nothing against, I'm brown, like light brown, I say cappuccino. But in reality, God is, for a lot of people, the God of Western civilization. And that's because of the shift that happened when it became a Western church. And there's nothing wrong with that, because the first missionaries that went out were Jewish. When the Jewish believers went out to, like the apostles, did they stop being Jewish? Or did they integrate God into their culture? Did they deny their culture to embrace something new? Well, they had to disregard some of the things that Jesus taught them that are not of value anymore, because he's come to fulfill the law. But they still continued to, live out the law to the best of their capacity. And there was a lot of dynamic in the early church. Then when we think of the majority of, the Messianics becoming more or less, and the majority became more Gentiles, then of course we had Orthodoxy come forth. We had the different councils that happened. And then of course, Orthodoxy, or at least the Eastern Church, was very healthy for many years. And then Islam came, and literally there was a shift that happened. And then of course, we know Catholicism came forth, the Crusades happened, and all the way up to the Reformation or the Renaissance, which led to scientific awakening, which led to the Reformation, of course, of what happened in Central Europe, specifically between Protestants and Catholics. And then they ruled for many hundreds of years, until then evangelicalism came forth. And then, of course, the evangelicals didn't stay in Europe very strongly, moved to North America. And then we have the whole evangelical, the Baptists and so on that came forth, or that at least grew there. And then looking further down, we can actually see then Pentecostalism coming in only about 100 years ago. And each of these have done their own, how should I say, their own birth, their own wave of expressing God, highlighting God, valuing God. For example, if we look here, we realize that the schism happened, and then there were multiple branches that broke out. And in each one, we can look back and say, oh, they were evil. Well, I don't know if I would say evil. I think they did not know better. They did what they believed to be true and right. Not all of it was good. Not all of it was right, but they did a lot of things that influence nations, cultures, generations, which we today still benefit from in part. This is the beauty, that God will take space whenever God is given space. The question is, how much space do we give him? And how much room do we believe God wants to inhabit in our lives and in the things that we do? Alone, if we look at the evangelical side of things, we can see how much splits there were there as well, and how many churches still today in the evangelical circles will split off and start their own smaller churches because of often doctrinal and theological differences. And this, all of it, to a certain degree, broke my heart at the time when I did some of this research, just to get an overview personally for myself, until God came to me and said, something very simple. He said, Joseph, I will always reach out. But those who listen will listen. Those who hear will hear. Those who will, then I will invite to act. And those who will act, then through what they do, through what they speak, through the way they communicate, I will touch the hearts of those who are hungry. And I think God has always been invitational. He's always invited us to discover more of him and to share him more and more. This leads me to this reality that if we think of the early church, and these are some of the drawings that they found in some of the early churches, Christ was part of everything. He was the God of all nature. Then we moved away and we did similar to the temple. We created the Holy of Holies within our own churches. When Christ ripped the temple curtain from top to bottom, or when his death, initiated that, it opened the gate for us to enter into his presence. But yet these women are standing outside the altar saying, I cannot enter that place. And yet that's exactly where God is inviting us to the most sacred place, to the place where he resides. because of what Christ has done. And so there were these Orthodox churches that were very, very, very rich. They had a lot of gold. Then we have the poor ones that took the icons, and they clearly communicated the Christ the child, Christ the teacher, Christ who suffered, and so on. And they did it with wood because that was what they could do culturally. It was their best way to express what they had discovered of this God, of the creator. And if we look at the Catholics, they created these huge cathedrals, and they put all kinds of art and all kinds of paintings there. And this, of course, influence again. It was very rich to do this because the Catholic Church was friends with a lot of kings. And of course, the glory of God was highlighted in the Catholic Church very often. Why? Because kings were people who also wanted to have glory. So of course, when those two merge together, when geopolitical dynamics happen, and of course, faith and state come together, often they will have common values. And so cathedrals rose to show the glory of God, and the pews would be very small at the bottom. God would be far away on top. And that by default created distance, that I am not able to reach the Lord because he's so far away. He is beyond reach because he's like a king. And if I cannot enter the king's court, how will I enter the creator's court? And so a lot of these things, just by the sheer cultural dynamics that were created, because of what? That's how we have been given an image of God that's been very, stuck in a certain way. When we think of the Vatican and we think of how many years it took for them to create this place, but to separate it as a place where a church has a seat and so on. And then on to go to some of these stained glass windows and seeing that now we're portraying kings and lords and knights, or that we are showing more modern perspectives. And you can see the shift of what's happening. We had God in the middle, and then slowly we put ourselves in the middle to the point that it became about me worshiping the Lord and about us and about our relationship with God, not God's relationship with us, which is, I think it's both, but we should highlight God's relationship with us as well. And on to looking at a classic Lutheran church today, where there's hardly any images. It's because of the reaction against the Catholics. 30-year war would lead to a clear statement on how I expect and reflect God. Finally, when we look at evangelical churches, we have these pews, and we have the choir, and we have the pulpit, where the preaching of the word becomes the key element. Finally, when we look at some of the reality today, a lot of evangelicals are finding their faith more true or more endearing in classical or traditional churches like the Catholics or the Orthodox. And I know many people that have converted to Orthodoxy or to Catholicism because they find a deeper meaning in connecting with God in those denominations. And I think when you look at it, if we think of denominations as, look of it as a rainbow color, of the idea that there are just different facets of the faith, but that together, when they come together and would walk in unity, could then we know that spectrum going through a prism will reflect pure light, and light pierced through a prism will reflect the colors of the rainbow. So I wonder if there's something there that we have to at least be chewing on and thinking about. For a long time, Christianity was just fashionable. And I think when we look at even modern expressions of how we're doing it today, this was the cover album from Michael Jackson's "This Is It," and Christians took it and said, "Jesus Christ, He is it." And we popularized Christ by taking the Coca-Cola sign and made T-shirts called "Jesus Christ," enjoy Jesus Christ, or prayer, just pray it, and then took the Nike swoosh, or the nice little Jesus fish. The ethis fish that we know from all around the world, to the point that I remember one time a young person and I were talking. They said, "Was Jesus swallowed by a whale?" I'm like, no, that's Jonah. This is Jesus. Jesus didn't get swallowed by a whale. Because when some people that don't know the story or mix the stories, that's what they see. Now, we can use culture and modern ways of communicating God, but are we always creating a subculture, or are we trying to truly learn to find revelation from God to be able to impact God and communicate Him in this age and time? So who can communicate God? Well, God has called you and me to do that. And I think this is where we have some homework to do. There's nothing wrong in reflecting what was, but I think we need to be in our day to day. We need to be in modern times and recognize what are the signs of the times, what are the needs of the times, what are people hungry for, and exactly discover the hunger that they have, and then find means by which we can communicate God and form a new image of God that truly makes I don't say fashionable and modern. No, I want to say I'm trying to even find a word that would really fit that. Something essential, something that I cannot not live without this. Like I need to live with God. I need to walk with God. I need to discover God so I can discover my place in this world, my purpose in this world, and where I'm heading. And I think this is where I think God has told us the Son is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn. And if we are to be imitators of Christ, then we need to be like Christ. And that is the whole topic in itself. But let's put it this way. If we can be Christ-like in our daily lives, whether it be with our neighbors, with our colleagues, with our relatives, and with everyone, we would do a better job, because God has called you and me to be able to communicate Him best. No building, no book, no doctrine, nothing will communicate God more than a life lived for God, and a life that truly reflects God in the details of life, as well as in the overall arching of our story as we endeavor forward. And with 1 minute left, I will conclude and say thank you for, hopefully this has challenged us a little bit to recognize that we have a lot of homework ahead of us, but that God has been good. I want to finish with one story, which I think is quite heartfelt. My daughter, when she was 4 years old, she came and drew a picture of me. I can't even show you the picture. It looked pretty bad. I was very big-nosed. I had a huge head that wasn't even symmetric. It was asymmetric. It went all directions. And it looked pretty monstrous to a certain degree. But remember, she was 4 years old and she's trying to learn how to draw. As a parent, I didn't look at it and say, child, I'm a designer. You are just young. So go learn how to draw. When you come back, then give it to me. No, I took that painting, drawing, I put it on the fridge, and people would come and say, "Woo, what is that?" I'm like, "That's me." And they're like, scared me for a minute. I'm like, well, that's where a 4-year-old is. They don't know how to properly grasp the fullness of what a person is, but they can take glimpses of it. Of course, today she can design or draw much better. But in the same way, I felt that God was saying, Joseph, the church has been growing. And as it's been growing, it has tried to take snippets of who I am and draw them and reflect them to the world. You look back at it and you think from your journey that it's ugly or bad or broken. In reality, it's that this is where they were at. So be patient as I am patient, because I'm calling all men to me, all cultures to myself. And if they listen to my voice and follow my voice, then they will know more, they will see more, they'll understand more, and they'll be able to articulate more. Amen.